In 1998, Venezuela was the richest country in South America. Their GDP per capita was $6,000, higher than Chile, higher than Brazil. Fast forward to 2025, and 7 million people have fled the country. That's 1/4 of the entire population. Inflation hit 344,000% in 2019 alone. A cup of coffee that cost 450 bolivars in the morning would cost 1,000 bolivars by afternoon. Everyone points at Maduro. The news shows his face next to empty shelves and starving children. But what if I told you Venezuela's economic collapse was set in motion decades before Maduro ever took power? What if he was just the final domino in a chain that started falling in the 1970s, orchestrated by bankers, oil companies, and foreign governments who knew exactly what they were doing? By the end of this video, you'll understand why Venezuela didn't fail by accident. You'll see the fingerprints of Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Russia, and China all over this disaster. And you'll recognize the same pattern being deployed right now against other countries. I'm the quiet financial historian, and I analyze the economic catastrophes everyone pretends not to see. Today, we're dissecting Venezuela, but not the sanitized version you get from mainstream media. We're going deep into the mechanics of how a country with the world's largest oil reserves became an economic wasteland. First, I'll show you how Venezuela's economy was structurally doomed long before Chavez came to power. The rot started in the 1970s when they struck oil. Second, we'll track exactly which banks and countries made billions while Venezuelans starved. Names, numbers, dates, all of it. Third, I'll prove to you why this matters right now, because the Venezuela blueprint is being rolled out in Pakistan, Egypt, Tunisia, and possibly others as we speak. Let's start in 1922. That's when Venezuela discovered oil. Standard Oil, the American company, found massive reserves in Lake Maracaibo. For the next 50 years, American and European companies controlled Venezuela's oil. They extracted it, refined it, sold it, and gave Venezuela a small cut. By the 1970s, Venezuela was producing 3.7 million barrels per day. Oil money was flooding in. The government built highways, hospitals, universities. Caracas became known as the Manhattan of South America. Glass skyscrapers everywhere. Venezuelans were flying to Miami just to go shopping because their currency was so strong. But here's what nobody talks about. When you have that much oil wealth concentrated in one place, it doesn't build a healthy economy, it builds a rentier state. That means the government gets rich from oil rents, not from productive economic activity. They're not manufacturing goods, they're not building tech industries, they're not exporting agriculture, they're just sitting on oil and collecting checks. Every sector of the economy became dependent on oil revenue. If you wanted to start a business, you needed government connections to get cheap dollars for imports. If you wanted a job, you worked for the government or for PDVSA, the state oil company. In 1976, President Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized the oil industry. He created PDVSA to control Venezuela's oil. On paper, smart move. Take back control from foreign companies. Keep the profits at home. But nationalization came with a hidden cost. PDVSA became a political tool. Every president used it as a piggy bank. Need to fund social programs. Take from PDVSA. Need to buy political loyalty. Hand out PDVSA jobs to supporters. Need to win an election. Promise cheaper gas. Subsidized by PDVSA. By the 1980s, PDVSA had 60,000 employees. Most of them were political appointees with no experience in oil production. Meanwhile, the oil infrastructure was aging. Wells needed maintenance. Refineries needed upgrades. Engineers were leaving for better opportunities in Texas and Norway. But instead of reinvesting profits into the oil industry, the government spent it on consumption, subsidies, handouts, bureaucratic expansion. Then came the real killer. In the 1980s, oil prices dropped. OPEC was overproducing. New oil fields opened in the North Sea and Alaska. Venezuela's oil revenue got cut in half almost overnight. But government spending didn't stop. They kept the subsidies. They kept the bloated bureaucracy. They kept the political patronage system. So how did they cover the gap? Debt. Massive, unsustainable debt. Citibank, JP Morgan, Chase Manhattan, they all lined up to lend Venezuela money. The loans were structured as oil-backed bonds, meaning Venezuela promised to pay back the loans with future oil revenue. They were literally mortgaging oil that hadn't been pumped out of the ground yet. Between 1982 and 1988, Venezuela's foreign debt tripled from $7 billion to $81 billion. Interest payments alone were eating up 30% of the national budget. In 1989, the IMF stepped in with a structural adjustment program. You know the drill. Cut government spending, eliminate subsidies, privatize state assets, open your markets to foreign competition. President Perez had no choice. He agreed to the terms. On February 27, 1989, he announced that gas prices would double overnight, public transportation costs would skyrocket, food subsidies would be slashed. The next day, Caracas exploded. Riots broke out across the city. People called it the Caracazo. The government deployed the military. Soldiers opened fire on protesters. Official death toll was 300. Independent estimates put it over 3,000 dead. That was the breaking point. By the mid-1990s, half of all Venezuelans were living in poverty. Not because of socialism, not because of Chavez, because the oil economy had been hollowed out by debt, corruption, and IMF austerity. The elite were still getting rich. Oil executives lived in gated compounds in Caracas. Politicians sent their kids to American universities. But the average Venezuelan was eating one meal a day. Unemployment hit 20%. Crime exploded. The murder rate tripled. And here's the kicker. American banks knew this was coming. In 1983, Citibank's internal memos warned that Venezuela's debt was unsustainable. They lent them more money anyway. Why? Because when Venezuela defaulted, Citibank could restructure the debt at higher interest rates and take ownership of state assets. It's called odious debt. Lend to a corrupt government, wait for default, then extract everything during the restructuring. It happened in Argentina, it happened in Greece, it happened in Venezuela. By 1998, the Venezuelan economy was in shambles. PDVSA was underfunded and mismanaged. Oil production was declining every year. Infrastructure was crumbling. The political elite had stolen billions and stashed it in offshore accounts. Into that chaos walked Hugo Chavez. Chavez was a former military officer who led a failed coup in 1992. He spent 2 years in prison, got released, and ran for president in 1998. His pitch was simple. The elite have robbed you. The Americans have exploited you. Vote for me and I'll redistribute the oil wealth to the people. He won in a landslide with 56% of the vote, and for the first few years, he delivered. Oil prices started climbing in the early 2000s. By 2008, oil hit $140 per barrel. Venezuela was swimming in cash again. Chavez launched the Bolivarian missions, massive social programs funded entirely by oil revenue. Mission Robinson taught 1.5 million adults to read. Mission Barrio Adentro brought Cuban doctors to poor neighborhoods and built free health clinics. Mission Vivienda built hundreds of thousands of public housing units. Poverty dropped from 50% in 1999 to 25% by 2008. Extreme poverty fell even more. For millions of Venezuelans, Chavez was a hero. But Chavez made the same fatal mistakes as every leader before him. He didn't diversify the economy. Oil went from 80% of exports under the old government to 95% under Chavez. He shut down what little manufacturing and agriculture Venezuela had left. Everything became dependent on oil. In 2003, PDVSA workers went on strike. They were protesting Chavez's political interference in the company. Chavez responded by firing 18,000 workers, nearly half the workforce, gone. He replaced experienced engineers and geologists with political loyalists who had no idea how to run an oil company. Oil production immediately started falling. In 2001, Venezuela produced 3.1 million barrels per day. By 2013, when Chavez died, production had dropped to 2.5 million barrels per day. By 2020, it was under 500,000 barrels per day. The oil industry collapsed from the inside. But Chavez's biggest mistake was making enemies with the United States. In 2002, the Bush administration supported a coup attempt against Chavez. Venezuelan military officers, backed by business elites and with tacit U.S. approval, kidnapped Chavez and tried to install a new government. The coup failed after 2 days when loyal military units and mass protests forced the plotters to back down. But that was the turning point. Chavez knew the U.S. wanted him gone, so he started looking for allies elsewhere. He sold oil at discounted rates to Cuba in exchange for doctors and teachers. He made deals with Russia and China, trading oil for loans and military equipment. He kicked out American oil companies that refused to accept new contract terms. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips sued Venezuela for $30 billion in international courts. Venezuela was cut off from American credit markets. Wall Street banks stopped lending. International arbitration courts ruled against Venezuela again and again, freezing assets abroad. When Chavez died of cancer in 2013, Nicolas Maduro inherited an economy that was a ticking time bomb. Oil production was falling, inflation was rising, foreign reserves were depleted, the government was surviving on Chinese loans. And then, in 2014, the bomb went off. Oil prices crashed from $110 per barrel to $30. Saudi Arabia was flooding the market to punish Russia and hurt American shale producers. Venezuela got caught in the crossfire. Overnight, oil revenue dropped by 70%. The government couldn't pay for imports. Shortages began, first toilet paper, then food, then medicine. But the collapse wasn't just bad luck. It was accelerated by coordinated economic warfare. Starting in 2014, the Obama administration imposed sanctions on individual Venezuelan officials, freezing their assets and banning them from entering the U.S. In 2017, the Trump administration expanded sanctions to target Venezuela's oil sector. American companies were banned from buying Venezuelan oil or selling Venezuela equipment and technology needed to maintain oil production. In 2019, the U.S. went further and imposed a full embargo. Any company doing business with PDVSA would be cut off from the U.S. financial system. That meant Venezuela couldn't sell oil to anyone except China and Russia, and even they demanded steep discounts. Let me be clear about what sanctions do. Sanctions hurt ordinary people. When you cut a country off from the international banking system, you create hyperinflation. When you ban oil exports, you destroy the government's ability to import food and medicine. Between 2013 and 2020, Venezuela's GDP collapsed by about 75%. The US government said the sanctions were designed to pressure Maduro into stepping down. But economists who studied the sanctions estimated they killed 40,000 Venezuelans in 2017 and 2018 alone from lack of access to food and medicine. The UN called it collective punishment, and here's the part that should make you angry. While Venezuelans were starving, Wall Street banks were making money off the collapse. In May 2017, Goldman Sachs bought $2.8 billion worth of PDVSA bonds for $865 million. They paid 31 cents on the dollar. They were betting that Venezuela would eventually restructure its debt and pay back bondholders at a higher rate. Goldman's traders knew people were dying. They bought the bonds anyway. When the news leaked, there was a brief outcry. Goldman issued a statement saying they were providing liquidity to the market. Then everyone forgot about it. Goldman is still holding those bonds, waiting for a regime change so they can cash out. JP Morgan did the same thing. Citibank too. They bought distressed Venezuelan bonds at huge discounts and lobbied the US government to keep sanctions in place so the bonds would eventually be worth more. Meanwhile, Russia and China were playing a different game. They weren't buying bonds, they were buying the oil itself. In 2007, Venezuela owed China $6 billion. By 2020, Venezuela owed China over $60 billion. How did China structure these loans? Simple. Venezuela pays back the loans by shipping oil directly to China. 400,000 barrels per day go straight to Chinese refineries. China gets below market prices. Venezuela has no choice but to accept. Russia did the same through Rosneft, the state-owned oil company. Rosneft loaned Venezuela $6 billion and took partial ownership of PDVSA's assets as collateral. When Venezuela couldn't pay, Rosneft took control of oil fields. Russia now extracts and sells Venezuelan oil and keeps the profits. So let me paint the picture. Goldman Sachs bought Venezuela's debt for pennies, hoping to profit when the government collapses. China is taking 400,000 barrels of oil per day for the next 30 years to pay off loans. Russia owns oil fields outright. American oil companies that got kicked out of Venezuela are now drilling in Guyana, right across the border, on oil fields that Venezuela claims are theirs. ExxonMobil found 11 billion barrels of recoverable oil in Guyana. They're pumping it out as fast as possible before Venezuela can do anything about it. See the pattern? Venezuela's collapse wasn't a failure. It was a business model. Loan a country money, encourage them to rely entirely on commodity exports, wait for prices to crash, impose sanctions that prevent recovery, buy up their assets for pennies when they default. Repeat. It happened in Argentina in 2001 when the IMF forced austerity. The economy collapsed and foreign investors bought privatized utilities for nothing. It happened in Greece in 2015 when the Troika demanded pension cuts and tax hikes, crashed the economy, and German banks bought Greek ports and airports. It happened in Lebanon in 2020 when the currency collapsed and Gulf investors started buying real estate in Beirut at 90% discounts. And right now, as I'm recording this, the same playbook is being used on multiple countries. Pakistan owes China $30 billion that they can't pay, so they're handing over mining rights to copper and gold deposits. Argentina just signed a new IMF deal that requires them to privatize the state airline and sell off lithium reserves. Sri Lanka handed over the Hambantota port to China for 99 years because they couldn't pay back a $1.4 billion loan. Egypt is negotiating to sell Mediterranean gas fields to cover their IMF debt. Tunisia is facing the same choice. You want to know the real crime? Maduro is a terrible leader. He's corrupt, he's authoritarian, he's incompetent, but he's the final domino. The collapse started 50 years ago when Venezuela became an oil state. It accelerated in the 1980s when they took on unpayable debt. It was locked in during the 1990s when the IMF gutted the economy. Chavez tried to resist and made it worse by refusing to diversify. Maduro inherited a disaster and had no idea how to fix it. But the collapse was always inevitable, because the international financial system is designed to create Venezuelas. Poor countries are encouraged to borrow. They're told to focus on exporting commodities. When prices crash, they're told to accept austerity and privatization. When they refuse, sanctions are imposed. When they collapse, their assets are bought for nothing. 7 million Venezuelans fled the country, not because of socialism, because of a controlled economic demolition disguised as incompetence. And the media will never tell you this story, because the banks that engineered it advertise on their networks. The oil companies that profited from it fund their parent corporations. So instead, you'll see images of empty grocery stores and Maduro's face. You'll be told it's socialism's fault. You'll be told it's corruption. You'll be told it's incompetence. All of which are partially true, but none of which explain how Goldman Sachs made billions while children starved. Here's what keeps me awake. The same economic conditions that destroyed Venezuela exist in multiple countries right now. Pakistan has 130 billion in external debt, a single major export sector in textiles, political instability, and one of the worst inflation rates in the world. Egypt imports 80% of its food, has a 165 billion in external debt, and just devalued its currency by 50% under IMF orders. Tunisia has 40% youth unemployment, riots over food prices, and is negotiating another IMF austerity package. Even developed economies aren't immune. Look at the UK in 2022, when pension funds nearly collapsed and the government had to do an emergency bailout. Look at Credit Suisse, a 166-year-old Swiss bank, failing overnight and being absorbed by UBS. The Venezuela playbook is being refined. The next collapse will be faster and harder to see coming. And when it happens, the media will blame the leader. They'll call it corruption or authoritarianism or bad governance, but you'll know better. It's not a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's how global finance extracts wealth from the periphery to the core. It's how banks profit from sovereign debt. It's how superpowers control resource-rich countries without direct colonization. So here's my question for you. If Venezuela's collapse was engineered, not accidental, which country is next? Go into the comments right now and drop your prediction. Pakistan, Egypt, Tunisia, Argentina, Turkey. I'll respond to every single one.